Reading from the Gospel of Matthew. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their crosses, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Here ends the reading. There are many challenges and much suffering going on in the world today, as we all well know, but this is nothing new. Most of us are well aware of the tragedies that affect and impact our lives. In 1984, when I was the rector of a church in central Louisiana, an enthusiastic and very idealistic young trauma nurse who worked at a neighboring hospital and a member of my parish came in to me in the sacristy before church service on a Sunday morning and said, "You have to do something." And I wondered, what was it that I needed to do? And she proceeded to tell me that I needed to speak on behalf of the suffering of AIDS patients because one young man had been thrown out of the hospital that very morning. She had worked the night shift and seen that doctors, once they had discovered he had AIDS, would no longer treat him and did not want him back at the hospital. Well, that was, of course, with the mid-'80s, and people were very fearful of AIDS and all of its possible implications. They didn't understand. They thought that AIDS was something you got just simply by being in the room with someone. So this particular call, this challenge of AIDS and the treatment of AIDS patients was something I certainly hadn't wanted to deal with and was in fact actively seeking to avoid after she engaged me. But thanks to her persistence and in spite of some vicious and rather loud opposition, and with even only my reluctant support and leadership, we were able, thanks to her pushing, to establish the Central Louisiana AIDS Task Force. And that was able to bring and address compassionate care to people suffering from AIDS. In Matthew's Gospel, we learn that the disciples had one idea of where they and Jesus were going. They understood the mission to be one way, and Jesus, in fact, confronted them with a very different reality, that he was going to suffering and even death, and that those who would follow him would likely be challenged in the same ways. In light of my own experience and that of the apostles in the Gospel, I find myself drawn to these verses today. In fact, the very verses that that young woman heard that Sunday that she had come to me. Jesus says, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." I find these verses often elicit three very distinct responses. Some, like Dr. Martin Luther King, seem to embrace Jesus' words, feeling themselves both called and capable of making decisions that reflect the most profound Christian commitment, even to the point of sacrifice and death. For them, the words are a real invitation. For other Christians, like myself, we struggle to find joy in these words at times. Sometimes we doubt our ability to embrace the cross and even recognize our willingness to run from it, to hate the fear, the confrontation that might come out of it, as I did when I sought to start addressing the issue of caring for people with AIDS. Others experience this as a command to denigrate themselves, and they can pinpoint many times where in our culture specific persons or groups have been told by their oppressors to bear their cross. Not all struggle and suffering, they point out, is beneficial, and so they are understandably leery of blanket statements that seem to legitimate oppression. For both groups, Jesus' words are a burden, whether imposed on them or taken on them through the message of others. There may, however, be a third way to interpret these words, which is simply to recognize that suffering indeed happens and that we will participate in one way or another. And finally, that the good news in all of this is whether we choose it and embrace it or resist it, Christ is present with us in it. Based on my own experience, the cross isn't always something that we choose, but rather something that may find us, as my experience coming with the working for those suffering with AIDS. Sometimes what is redemptive in the challenges or suffering we experience is obvious, as in the formation of an AIDS task force that addressed compassionate care. Sometimes it's hard to tell if there's anything good at all, let alone redemptive, in the suffering that we see or experience when we engage in embracing challenges to oppression and injustice. And yet Christ identifies with all of our suffering and promises to meet us in ours, especially when it's in the cause of healing, justice, mercy, compassion, and transformational love. So what does take up your cross and deny yourself look like? I certainly believe deny yourself does not mean forget all about yourself, or certainly not to debase yourself. Perhaps it's following Jesus' lead and to do the best of our ability to make decisions and act in a way that reflects God's love for us and for all people. I think what denying yourself looks like is seeing that you and I are part of something larger, in recognizing that there is, in fact, no meaningful you or I apart from us. Suffering should not be idealized or spiritualized and never justified in its own end. It should regularly be resisted, particularly when we move to resist the actions and systems that increase the suffering of others. But trust me, suffering, chosen and sacrificial or unbidden, will find us and include us. The good news is Jesus is and will be there. There are many challenges, much suffering going on, whether related to COVID, racial injustice, economic hardship, emotional despair, environmental degradation, political divisions, and more. In all these things, however, it is not just Christ's cross that is present, but Christ himself, holding us, lamenting with us, encouraging us, and promising us the strength to endure. And as we endure, to flourish, and flourishing to help others do the same.